we're talking more about an issue that is in the news at the moment, following, of course, that Ministerial Task Team, where after which it was decided that history would now be made compulsory, of course, subject to a whole range of conditionalities. And joining me here in the studio to talk about this is Sekiba Lekgoathi, who is an associate professor of history, as well as a member of that ministerial team that undertook studies on this particular issue, as well, of course, as our own senior researcher, Angelo Fick. Gentlemen, before we went to break, both of you raised some interesting points, one on the teaching, but also on what really history is. I want to touch first, Prof, on the standard of teaching, because as many people have argued, if bad, it could actually lead to children being dismissive of history and not showing an interest even.
Yeah. I have to say that, you know, there are some good teachers out there, teachers of history. And, you know, history teaching has actually gone a long way. So in schools where the resources are there and you've got well-qualified and dedicated teachers, I think, you know, there's very good history teaching that is actually taking place there. But then you've got a lot of instances where teaching is simply done by, you know, people who are not even, teachers who are not even qualified history teachers, because of this assumption that history is a soft subject. And so any teacher in the school, regardless of his training, his or her training or lack of training, can actually teach history. This is precisely what kills the discipline, because the discipline requires specialized training. It's about, you know, various methodologies. It's about critical skills. How do you teach critical skills if you have not been inducted in those skills? If you have not done history at your tertiary institution as a major, it becomes a problem because you are not well rooted in the content of history. So no wonder that we have learners who are saying history is boring, because the teachers reduce it to facts, because that's probably how they were taught history in their own schooling. So until such time that we have well-qualified teachers, and this is one of our recommendations in the Ministerial Task Team report, that you really need to you have well-qualified teachers. You need to train well-qualified teachers before you can even think of, you know, implementing history as a compulsory subject at FET level, meaning grade 10 to grade 12.
Well, of course, which takes us back to the issue of interpreting the facts, because it's not just about what happened, when, and how, but in contextualizing and interpreting those facts.
And that's presumably where, and we have a very rich tradition of very good historians working in tertiary institutions in this country. So, and those are not all people who agree with one another. There are contestations in the field of historiography, and particularly Southern African historiography. And there's also contestation about African historiography. And I think it is very important for us to remind people that African history is not some kind of, let's talk about the history of Africa. It is about people who are African, who've been writing about the history of this continent for, you know, decades. This is not some new phenomenon. And because of South Africa's isolation during apartheid, much of that scholarship was often missing in the South African space. And Mahmoud Mamdani was among a group of people who pointed this out to us in the late 1990s, that South Africa's relationship to Africa in African studies and in African history often took its cue from Europe and used European and North American textbooks to teach African history. And that, I think, is a shift that has happened over the last generation. And so it's not just about the content, but it's also about the evaluation of what counts as history and what counts as prehistory. So for many people, South Africa's history begins in 1652, as if there weren't people who lived here, had economics, had social relations, made differences in the world they lived in this part of the world prior to 1652. And it is that approach which says, what is it that we can talk about in terms of African societies that we will know because we pay attention to historiography, that will not allow a politician to think and to say that culture and civilization came with colonization, because it would understand history as an argument based in content, based on methodologies, based on an approach to the historical record that isn't about thumb-sucking and about commonsensical understandings gained from a colonial, racist, apartheid education that said Africa has no history.
And of course, Prof, I mean, history isn't just political.
History isn't just political. You know, there's cultural history, you know, the social history, which is about history from, you know, the perspective of the people that are not in power, the ordinary people, the poor people. Their perspectives are also important because they inform who we are. But can I also just respond to this whole question of what has actually been taught in our curriculum, what has actually been emphasized?
Very briefly,
you know, it's precisely sort of the moment when Africa, you know, got into contact with Europe from the 1600s. That is really the focus of, you know, history in the curriculum. And there's really a need to go back in time because Africa and South Africa has got a very long and rich history. And we can actually get to that history through various methodologies such as archaeology. You know, if we integrate archaeology with history, it enables us to talk about, you know, Africa from as far back as the 1700s in terms of the complexities, the civilizations on the African continent, in Southern Africa, in East Africa and West Africa, the Mapungubzes, you know, the metallurgy, the mining technologies, and the long-distance trade that actually happened, so that, you know, Southern Africa does not only just become interesting as a historical subject, only as a result of contact with Europeans, but you can begin to talk about complexity even in the pre-colonial era. And that's where we need to go if we are going to make history more interesting for learners, because that's really, in my experience as a history teacher, you know, learners, students out there are actually crying out for that kind of history. They don't know much about it.
Gentlemen, thanks to both of you. Unfortunately, that's where we're going to leave it for this evening. Sekiba Lekgoathi is an associate professor of history and a member of the Ministerial Task Team, as well as, of course, eNCA's own senior researcher, Angelo Fick.